Dear colleagues, it's really a pleasure for me being here because it's actually really my first time in Norway. The first time I actually got here, I remember I turned down an invitation 2 or 3 years ago, but now I'm here, and it's interesting to meet a country, even if you just stay for a couple of hours. I'm very thankful to Nupi for this very short-term invitation to come here. Thankful for the very kind invitation to talk about Germany in Europe, which I believe is, as you said, Germany, tipping point country, a very interesting country to look at. And a country which is in search for itself, to say this up front. I wouldn't say that there's anything sort of completely decided about where Germany goes, can go, wants to go, and so on and so forth. So what I want to do is to give you before I talk about the Euro crisis, I wanted, and sort of what have we been experiences with Germany in the past 2 or 3 years from 2010 onwards, to give you a little impression about how did we slip into the crisis? What was the sort of condition of Germany before the crisis? What were the 20 years before? What did Germany try to do with Europe? And what also were the changes within Germany to then take the crisis 3 years as a backdrop against this, what happened before? What I mean here is that the historical context is, and I think it feeds into this, say, the narrative of betrayal, that when we did the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s, we already had a very harsh German discussion against the euro. Yeah, and it was all this sort of, do we need to give up the D-Mark against unification talk? And you remember Thatcher, Mitterrand, the skepticism, German Europe, European Germany, and so on and so forth. But we need to put this into context that most of the, say, conservative, but also intellectual elite in terms of the lawyers and the economists, by then already in 92, basically would argue it cannot work out. We shouldn't do this. We need political union. You cannot do a currency union without some political fiscal and political federalism. So it was a big discussion. To not forget where we stand today, because actually my argument is we are having the same discussion that we had 20 years ago, with the difference that this time we need to solve it, right? There was also, and this is worth being reminded, there was a big deception with France. And I can say this because by then in 94, I worked actually in the Bundestag. I worked for Mr. Schäuble and Mr. Lamas. Certain of you know him. There was this Schäuble-Lamas paper, which was an offer on a silver plate to France to go for more integration. I remember the writing process of this paper very well. I remember selling it to France, and I remember being turned down by France. And it was a big deception because you need to remember that this happened in September 94, so it was basically 3 months before we entered northern enlargement with Finland, Austria, and Sweden. So it was basically the last idea to do the deepening stuff before we go for enlargement. And being turned down by France for a variety of domestic French reasons, because RPR, UMP, Giscard couldn't figure it out, so it was a big deception because the German idea was sort of, in a way, we did the policy, the economics first, and France should do the politics then, and the French basically didn't pay their price. That was a little bit the German perception, at least the elite's perception by then. So from there, you know the history. We went through Amsterdam to fix the leftovers from Maastricht. We went to Nizza to fix the leftovers from Nizza. From Amsterdam, we went to Laken to constitutional making. We turned down the constitution. We ended up with Lisbon. So basically, we tried 20 years to catch up the first intergovernmental conference of Maastricht political union, which basically remained unfinished to today. That's the whole story. We did the monetary ale, finished it in 2002, never finished the political union intergovernmental conference of Maastricht, and we are hanging out with this till today. And what is very important here to say is that during this process, where we had a couple of serious Franco-German clashes. Remember Nizza, when parity was at stake, and severe tensions in Franco-German relations, which is important. The French know, also psychologically wise, I think impacted largely on what happened in Germany. What I mean is, with the French know, the French basically mentally slipped out of Europe. This country by then, I'm not talking about France, but by 2005, country felt completely marginalized, had no interest in the Eastern enlargement process, felt sort of sulking, was confronted with a Europe it didn't want, remember Vidrine, and then the no and the Polish plumbers and the French elites lost Europe by then. So I think it's mentally very important to understand that by 2005, Germany felt sort of left alone with Europe. Felt mentally, emotionally sort of left alone with Europe. And this is important because I will come to this later, because by then Germany had already changed on a very also emotional, national sort of spin. Let me go back to Franco-German relations for a second. I mean, we always talk engine. I guess the engine was finished at the latest in 2003 when we went to Lokomotive ohne Anhänger, so train without engines, chocolate summit, Schröder-Chirac, sort of the two against the rest of Europe features. From Lokomotive ohne Anhänger, I think we went to Sarkozy to a competition mode. Sarkozy entering NATO, wanting to basically double Germany as the American junior partner on the continent, being more interested in transatlantic defense cooperation than the Germans, competition on Mediterranean Union versus Eastern enlargement, Eastern partnership thing. So we were in a competition mode. And by 2006 or 2007, I think Sarkozy realized that he wouldn't hold this competition mode just because the French economy was so much falling behind the German one by 2007. It's quite interesting to look at the economic figures because the real gap that built up between France and Germany, and which is visible today, built up since roughly 2007. You can look at export figures, at growth figures, at whatever macroeconomic detailed figures you take, you will see that the real gap between France and Germany started roughly in 2006 when Germany had sound fiscal policies again, was again back to fiscal solidity, had done the Hartz IV stuff, and France did not, and the gap increased, and the French economic weakness then later spilled into a political weakness, which brought asymmetry into the couple, and because of the asymmetry of the couple, Germany felt sort of being alone with Europe. And the rest was this sort of, say, the French sulking reaction to, okay. I think this is important as a background, and because why is this important? It's important to understand that this, say, incremental defection from Franco-German relations, or sort of by default disentanglement, in addition to a ever more complex Europe, enlargement 204, Europe without a radar years, in the last decade. And who leads Europe? Shall we do this alone? I mean, the Germans had clearly no ambition to lead Europe alone in the 2005, 6 years, 2005, 6, 7 years. And what the important thing to understand is that this defection from Europe came at a time where this innocent nationalism grew. Innocent nationalism, Soccer 2006, German flags, Lena song contest, satellite, export figures, BMW, wir sind wieder wer, Land der Ingenieure, the whole PR camp 2009, 20 years unification, the celebration, Brandenburger Tor, what have you, So while the one was basically downturning and downcurbing, the sort of national thing was upturning, And I underscore again, completely innocently, Nothing driven, no political concept, not masterminded, we want to run the world, to repeat history, nothing of this, completely innocent, And this is why it was sort of, couldn't be hedged, because it was so innocent and not masterminded in a way, It just was there at a moment, And this national context, I think, is very important because there is a subtext of this national context. And the subtext is, while all this was happening, Hartz IV, export, Germany, boom again, blah, 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 and while on an emotional scale this all could happen and be tangible for citizens, this sort of new Germany, Normalisierung und so weiter, you still had a huge chunk of people who basically were no longer benefiting from the German boom. Yeah, and I will come to this later, but this is very important to understand the public opinion during the Euro crisis. What I mean is that obviously, and we take the figures now, take the last health figure report of the European Commission, take any other figures you want to say, Germany in the past 5 years dramatically increased income spreads, dramatically increased social disparity, and so on and so forth. And by 2006-07, this was tangible. Yeah. So what I mean is, although Germany was reforming and doing better, the collective gain of this reform, and thus also the collective gain of Germany being in the euro, being the single market, the whole export gain, the statistical gain for the country, which you can read in any given statistic, was not evenly distributed among German citizens. And you had huge parts of citizens who basically did not benefit from it because of Hartz IV. Yeah? And this is very important to understand for what happens then. Yeah?
Yeah, just maybe not everybody know what
Hartz IV, yeah, these famous reforms when Schröder in 2002, basically reformed labor market, reformed retirement, health reform. I mean, to give you one figure, yeah, I'm happy to be that first generation which has the right, born 64, to work now 67 years, right? To then get 42% of the seal as a ceiling from my last net salary. Yeah, you can also say that this is Rentenenteignung. Yeah, I mean this in nominal terms is something like 70% decrease of retirement things that the generations of the 60s and 70s had. Yeah, I mean, to just give you that one figure, there are many other figures out, but to really look at the the social rudeness of what happened in many respects. I wasn't complaining here. I was just trying to make a point. Yeah. And this is important to understand, that the statistical gain, which was visible by 2006-07, wasn't an emotionally resented gain for everybody in German society. Yeah. So against these 2 or 3 backdrops, the institutional history since Maastricht, the dropout of France, the new Germany sort of narrative, plus the defection of Europe, the incremental disintegration, plus this sort of new Germany, new elites, new young people, new generation, new innocence, whatever, you need to read the crisis and what happened since 2010 in Germany, especially on the discourse mode, how we discussed this crisis and how we could get into this victimization sort of Germany talk. You need to read it against this backdrop, because if not, it's not understandable. Yeah, and I think this is in a way, I think this is one of the essential points I want to make. When the whole thing started in 28 with Goldman Sachs, with Lehman Brothers first, yeah, and then quickly we had to say the banks were saved, but then you had Iceland, then you had Ireland, then the whole system cracked. And when Germany was making in October 2008 the first very national statement that we guarantee our savings, and not we tried to do it Franco-German style, it didn't work. So it was a clear also a gap between France and Germany in that October 28. Germany guaranteed national savings and bonds and assets, but it wasn't a European decision. Yeah? So that basically also set the tone for the crisis, which is, in this crisis, everybody is on its own. Yeah? It was a tone setting more than a policy, but it was a tone setting, yeah, at that moment. Yeah. Priced in that everybody was surprised, priced in that nobody had a real answer, priced in that nobody really would know how dark it is, I guess, the very first days. Yeah, but I think there was a lot of this. And then from there, 2010, we are in Greece. And the German setting is also that we have these North Rhine-Westphalian elections. Very important. You need to understand that North Rhine-Westphalia is the biggest land in Germany, April 2010 to early 2011 month. Yeah. And during this international argument happening, why are the Germans naked? I go over. I think by mid-2011, Germany in the south and so on and so forth. But if we stop here, nothing is built and the next rain can fall, because we still didn't fix the systemic problems of the euro. We still didn't build a very strong roof in a way. We didn't go for fiscal federalism. We didn't U-turn the functions of ECB, so that we are still dealing with structural problems which we ultimately pampered over, but we didn't solve. So, and I think you put a big question mark where we stand here. I honestly don't know. You look at the last council conclusions. I think we are progressively and slowly coming to banking union and perhaps common deposit schemes, and it's a first step into mutualization of debt at some point, but now we are getting the whole complexity of what are then the legitimacy questions which follow out of fiscal federalism. So to which extent you need to federalize a political system if you go really for fiscal federalism. I think we are hanging with these questions around, and they are now there, and they won't be openly discussed before the German elections. That's pretty clear. So they will be discussed after the German elections, hopefully together with France, which is, I think, the question in the air. Where the French discussion will go. You can see a couple of consensus points where the French have gotten the story that they will need to reform, but you can also see very clearly that the French, in terms of fiscal harmonization, in terms of social discretionary policies, EU budget zone, and so have distinct positions from the Germans, and we will need to fix them. The good news here is that France and Germany are struggling again, and they are fighting again, because the problem of Merkozy was precisely the symbiosis. The problem of Merkozy was that France would not hold against Germany, and therefore Germany had now no encounter in the Eurozone. And that was when this overshooting hegemonic leadership basically could take place, because the only country that can stem against or hold against Germany ultimately is France. That's its role in the system. And the moment when France basically adopts the German argument too early, you immediately are in a symbiosis and in a condominium. You no longer give ownership to the others of Europe. The others feel completely destroyed, and the whole European engineering doesn't function. So Franco-German cooperation is the best way to sublimate German leadership, if you want to have it that bluntly. But you always need the French, and you need the French opposing Germany, because only then you get a decent compromise which is swallowable for the others, because if you get too much of a symbiosis, it gets like a top-down management of the Eurozone, and it just does not function, and we have seen that Merkozy didn't function. And in a way, I'm very happy that Hollande holds an intellectual economic argument against Germany, which will, half here, half there. I'm confident that there will be a compromise, but the compromise will not be where the Germans would have put the cursor. It will be slightly different on the scale. And that is good, because that is precisely the strength of the Franco-German tandem, that at some point you pull the Germans into a symmetric adoption policy, and the cursor is a little beyond the German point, and then it's ownership to the others, and you can have a European compromise. And hopefully this happens in the whole, after the German elections, EP elections, new commission, and that the whole thing will give us a new drive, and also a new drive for what I call the transnational democracy building. Because let's not lure ourselves. We have a transnational single market, transnational currency. At some point we will need to discuss the real stuff of a transnational democracy. It's not, the legitimacy question is at stake, and we need to redefine what sovereignty means. We need to redefine what legitimacy means. A couple of now transnational democracy building questions in the middle of Euroland, and we should be very honest about them. So I will stop with the last sentence on how this relates to the other policy areas, sort of, is Germany shaping the global Europe? And the answer is probably ever more increasingly, but slowly. So Germany is probably not sort of jumping at a leader position, sort of, I'm now the big strategic leader of Europe, nor will be sending troops to you, Libya, the questions here. But if you take a more slow look at what is really happening, then I think it's fair to say that Germany first got evidence that it needs to change. Second, had the strength to detect that it is in need of a strategic community, and that Germany decided to build this community up. That Germany has gotten the message that we are beyond a transatlantic NATO community and that the strategic community needs to be a European community, and that this community is sort of built up, but built up in the sense educating people, putting money on universities, getting the people together who quote unquote run this country in European affairs. And I think Germany is slowly getting there, and I can detail this. The third thing is that we did changes. Yeah, I mean, on Russia, it's pretty evident how when there was too much blaming of Germany because we were too much in bed with the Russians, we changed, we were constructive, we got the Poles on board, and we have a distinctly, clearly different German policy towards Russia today than, say, 3 or 4 years ago, which is much more embedded into a European approach. And so Russia is a very nice example where Germany had the learning curve that if it's Europeanizing its own policy, it gets better results. Yeah. On China, I guess we are slowly but carefully trying to get to a similar embedment, which is obviously difficult to achieve because of the export data, where Germany is so much singling out. But still, the message there is to get to the same learning curve. And more broadly, on a general strategic consensus, I think we are starting now discussions of how much are we compatible with CSDP missions. Can we hold Parlaments Vorbehalt? We are learning this, yeah? And I think the learning curve that Germany is now undergoing is that economy and strategy needs to come together. Yeah? That was always the strength of the US, that economy and strategy belong together, and that by this, the dollar is also a foreign policy tool. Yeah, and I think the German learning curve is now that first the euro is policy and not neutral. A currency is politics and not neutral, and therefore it should serve as a policy tool also in foreign affairs. I think there's a learning curve in Germany. Yeah, Geld ist politisch und nicht unpolitisch. And therefore, strategy and economy needs to come together. And strategy can only come through a European sublimation. Germany cannot go global alone, and Germany cannot do strategy alone. And for strategy, Germany needs Europe, because Europe is ultimately the normative binding and the normative set of value which only can resonate the German economic power. And if that is the process where we are going, that basically you find in the European normative consensus a sort of a glue for the German economic power, and you thus can bring German economic dominance together with a normative set of strategy for the European Union, then I think that would be the winning game for Europe at large, and I hope that this is taking place. Thank you.